Well, good morning, everybody. It's Tuesday. Almost didn't make it today. Somebody with the sense for internet connectivity explained to me how it is that my home Wi-Fi will not permit my computer to connect to the internet. But when I go to my phone hotspot, it works. I just don't get it all. But here we are. The deep state tried to keep us off the line today. That's because what we want to talk about is so blistering hot. It's going to hurt somebody's feelings. So pick a number. But first, what happened in the NBA last night?
Hold on. Look, I don't know what is going on with this Rumble studio. 1 second here. I'm going to try and add another destination and do it yet again. Same thing that happened yesterday. For whatever reason, having to patchwork this thing together on Rumble. Rumble needs to get their life together.
Well, maybe it's time for us to rumble on out of there. I mean, we've been having nothing but issues with them over time. Anyhow, in the cloud, you're saying it's the same thing happening today. Apparently, Mike's having issues. I'm having issues. But the world continues to spin, except in the NBA, where the Lakers are no more. And I don't know if you have any insight into that, Mike, but I mean, Lakers, Celtics, not, the Nuggets.
Let's see. All right, we're live on Rumble now. Welcome, everyone. And yes, the Los Angeles Lakers have been eliminated from the playoffs, and the Denver Nuggets have successfully made their first bid as a franchise into the NBA Finals. So that's exciting stuff, right? For a franchise that I think Carmelo Anthony announced his retirement this week. Carmelo Anthony was in the same draft class as LeBron James. So I think we've talked about that before. LeBron James is 38 years old. I believe Carmelo Anthony is a couple of years older, because recall that Carmelo Anthony actually went to Syracuse. LeBron came directly out of high school from St. Vincent, St. Mary's into the NBA and the Cleveland Cavaliers to that massive Nike deal that was sort of landscape shifting.
Yeah, I remember that at the time, thinking, is that smart to pass up college? Of course, now LeBron can buy and sell any number of us multiple times. But yeah, I don't know.
But look, I mean, so I'll put this on the screen just so everybody can see the bracket here, and we can sort of track I think I put this up yesterday as well.
Yeah, the brackets, yeah.
Yep. But now we've got one game left over in the East, the Heat and the Celtics. I think we talked yesterday about the Heat being up 3-0 on the Celtics. And I have every expectation that as of, this time tomorrow, it will be a Nuggets Heat showdown in the finals. And I think that that's a Hooper's dream. I've been watching the Nuggets since the playoffs have started and have really loved the style of basketball they play. Nikola Jokic is his name. Last night, here's his stat line: 30 points, 14 rebounds, 13 assists, a steal, and 3 blocks. He's an absolute monster. Now, credit to LeBron. His stat line was something like 40 points, 10 rebounds, 9 assists. Still not enough to get it done. I think the Nuggets beat them by a couple of points last night to complete the sweep. But the reality was that the Nuggets are objectively the better team. All that the Lakers could have hoped for was to slow them down and steal one here and there. Ultimately, the Nuggets were destined for this. I think the question in LA is what the heck their future really looks like. They've mortgaged all of their future draft picks and stuff to assemble the team that they currently have. And this year was, a little wild. But anyway, we'll be paying attention to that.
Well, speaking of paying attention, what is going on in your home state of North Carolina? When I first saw the story last night that Roy Cooper had declared a state of emergency regarding public funding, I thought, well, there you go, another prophecy fulfilled. The emergence of the public health state, another bold sweep for executive powers to accomplish some sort of imposition of an idiosyncratic view, this time of education, on the rest of us. But Cooper's declared a state of emergency without teeth. He apparently, this state of emergency that he's declared doesn't come with any sort of executive powers or assertions of executive powers. So what is he doing, and what's going on down there?
He's pitching a fit. He's acting like a toddler. and he's giving the entire of the Democrat establishment in North Carolina license to act like big babies. You know, I take specific exception to the use of state of emergency coming from the governor of North Carolina that used his executive powers throughout COVID to stamp out and rule as more of an authoritarian with a super heavy hand, picking winners and, more importantly, picking losers all over the state. I take specific exception of him using this rhetoric of state of emergency over legislative agenda items, those that have gone through the democratic process, those that the state legislature has ratified, right? And things that are being proposed. I take specific exception with him personally using the rhetoric of a state of emergency to bring some sort of urgent look from other people as to a situation that he politically disagrees with. The reality of what's going on with public education funding in North Carolina is not something that is unique to the state of North Carolina. We've talked about what's going on the country writ large.
What led him to declare the state of emergency? What particular aspects of public education funding?
So there have been two new budgets that have been presented to through the Senate and through the House, and these budgets are looking at 2023 24 school years and 24-25 school years, and looking at number one, budget overall for K through 12 education, teacher salaries and their raises every couple of years, and then a budget for school health personnel allotments, these sorts of things. And we can play some of the video if you want. It's a 6-minute video, but ultimately what he's saying is that the money that's being set aside for educators and teachers, et cetera, is just simply not enough. And this is because he thinks that this voucher program that has been expanded beyond what it was, and Norm, you and I covered that bill on previous streams. But he's essentially using the rhetoric that public tax dollars are going to fund private interests in the education realm. Ultimately, what he's talking about is that there is no more stranglehold over school curriculum, that the leverage that teachers and these massive administrative organizations that run North Carolina education no longer are able to unilaterally make decisions and hold people hostage. And I think be answerable to the calls of their constituents.
I give you a lot of credit for shedding a critical light on what's really going on down there. You know, I think most of us, when we send our, most of us who send our kids to public school, send them off in the morning with a lunch and hope that they can learn some reading, writing, and arithmetic and come home and be a slightly better person. I think what many of us learned in COVID, or many parents learned in COVID, is the kids are being taught things that they had no idea about, a DEI agenda, a view of American history that demonizes some people simply because of the color of their skin, a redistributive agenda that might bear a sort of social justice collectivism that the rest of us aren't down with, and it goes on. And so parents have begun to push back and look for alternatives. They've sought to both influence their local school board, or where possible and credible, take their children to private schools, and so vouchers permit that. The loss of control over public education has been discomfiting to many people, on the theory that the public education is the crucible by which we create the next genre of citizens, or clones, as the case may be, and where we indoctrinate children in common norms and values. And therefore, any threat to public education is a threat to collective visions of the good. And, I think, and so you see arguments along those lines. Cooper, I think, is suggesting now that vouchers and inadequate, in his view, financing of public education is somehow a threat to democracy, and hence the state of emergency that he's declared is somehow democracy is at stake, because some people are opting out of the public school system. People are opting out of the agenda that school administrators are choosing to cram down on their children. Here's a memo to Roy Cooper. Read your own state constitution. North Carolina, when I saw your story last night, Mike, I went to the North Carolina Constitution.
You said, yeah, you got into our statutes.
Yeah, well, and I wondered, does North Carolina have a social compact clause in its state constitution? And it does, right up near the top, I think, in the second section of the first article. Government is created by the people, for the people, and exists by their consent. And also, education, local control of education is right there in the Carolina Constitution. So when I first saw the story about Cooper, I thought that he had extended emergency powers, the same sort of powers that he had exercised under COVID. And if he had, I would be calling for his impeachment this morning.
Well, here
Because
T-Girl says Roy Cooper's kids go to private school, and I want to be clear. I know that that's typically a gotcha, and T-Girl, point well taken. I have experience. I was raised by and large through the public school system here in North Carolina.
Mhm.
And I had the rare opportunity to, I guess, contrast that with later in my high school years, private education and elite level private education. There's no comparison. I think I've said that on previous streams. I've talked with you, Norm, privately about that and my view of it. Education is something that I've long had, I think, a lurking passion for. And I think it has a lot to do with my background in athletics. I think that the two of those things go hand in hand, understanding the importance of grasping the fundamentals, setting important foundations, creating and maintaining good habits, right? And then understanding what to do in adversity and overcoming those things. I think that the physical and the academic or the intellectual work hand in hand. And for that reason, I very much am appreciative of my parents, affording me those opportunities along the way, but setting a standard and setting a standard that I could adopt for myself. But, having said that, of course, if you are of means, you want the best education possible for your kids. I don't fault Governor Cooper necessarily, and I'm T-Girl, don't take this as me saying that putting words in your mouth, but I don't fault Governor Cooper for having his children in private school. I fault him for two things. One, doing the same thing that he did during COVID, speaking into a TV camera in front of a green screen, acting with this solemnity. And, Marjorie Taylor Greene, maybe take a page out of this book when you're trying to pronounce words that you've never seen before. But
like Mr. Solemnity.
yes, but being very black pilled and very the
But
pop.
isn't that what governors? I mean, doesn't the chief executive of any given jurisdiction have a right to take to the bully pulpit and share his vision of the common good? Isn't
Sure,
that what it used to be?
but my issue is his use of the state of emergency. We just saw him use that to excess. Just a year or two. North Carolina was under its own emergency declarations until like late last year. Maybe it was a little sooner than that, but that emergency declaration in North Carolina continued for a long time. And there was, and at every step, he was using these vague indicators to obscure, what rights and liberties that people are endowed with, what they could actually do in their private lives, in their work lives, in their
No, I hear you. I get it.
etc. And then for him to take that as it just screams and reeks of desperation, because that is what he got used to doing, ruling from behind a TV camera, right?
Well,
Speaking to his constituents.
I think this is what bears watching. I think we need to keep a close eye, and thankfully, we've got our North Carolina correspondent and co-host, Mike Boyer, who's going to keep an eye on what's going on in the Tar Heel State. But we talked only last week, about North Carolina as being a cauldron of trends that are likely to emerge nationally. And this is a trend that we predicted a couple of years ago, Mike and I, when we talked about the emergence of the public health state in response to COVID. There was a cry for centralization, and so the line between state and local government began to be blurred. And then there was a cry for centralization within federal government, such that the lines between in the separation of powers doctrine at both the state and federal level began to blur, so that we had a stronger executive able to impose its vision of the common good on people. And we predicted at the time that COVID, as a biological crisis, might have required some initial collective response. But the genius of federalism is that each state has the right to work it out its own way. And the conflict in the COVID topic era was that there isn't a biology on which we all depend. We are physical beings, after all, infused with spirit or mind or soul or whatever it is that makes us us. But we all share bodies in common, and those bodies are susceptible to disease, and public health professionals may have insight on how to best maximize our chances for health. Okay, I get that. But once you've got that infrastructure in place, that legal infrastructure that makes it possible to declare something a public health emergency, and once you create an easy route to centralization and authoritarian assertions of power, it becomes all too easy for politicians to wave the red flag of state of emergency and aggrandize themselves. And I predicted it would come with respect to handguns. After all, the Centers for Disease Control have called handguns a public health emergency. There are those who believe that quote unquote systemic racism is a public health emergency. There are those who believe that climate change is a public health emergency. And all of these people want to aggrandize power, to impose a vision of the good on the rest of us. I didn't see it coming with respect to education. And so Cooper surprises me. My prediction is that, he's got this state of emergency out there, and little by little, either by executive decree or by way of legislative proposal, he's going to seek to reenact the COVID era strain of executive authority to impose his vision of the good on the people of North Carolina. And if he does, I hope that there are lawmakers out there who have a profound enough respect for local control and for the notion that, notwithstanding the reservation of police powers to the states under our federal system, those police powers are still limited, and we are governed by our consent. And people can consent, and they can withdraw that consent. And with respect to what's going on in North Carolina with Roy Cooper, I think a foundation for impeachment should begin to be laid. Because if he's going to try to create a unitary executive, a powerful executive that can govern by emergency decree in North Carolina, I don't think the people in North Carolina want anything to do with it. And if he gets away with it, it's a virus that'll spread state to state. And so I think we're going to keep
interesting that you use the term virus. I'm still taken with the methodology here, speaking to people through a camera, in front of a green screen, talking about state of emergency, pretending as if it's still COVID. I think I sent you a text last week, Norm, where I said that I believe that all of these social media companies need to be regulated by the FDA. And it was somewhat tongue in cheek. But what I'm getting at is this notion that there is something happening with the use of social media and technology to influence decision making and to keep people within these small bubbles where they can't recognize community in real life, where they can't pull themselves into the real world and have conversations without feeling as though they're going to be castigated or chastised or extricated from some sort of in group. And this is something I'm going to continue to kind of pay attention to, and I'll let my appeal to some sort of pharmaceutical or dietary or food component relating it to social media. I'll let that develop a little further, but I think that this is all somewhat related, right? Public education. You've got someone in the YouTube chat, photography here. It says the reason for educational indoctrination is to prepare for the future collective mentality if huge numbers of people cannot afford any semblance of self-reliance. I think that that might be a symptom of a larger problem. I think it's easy to look at what has happened and say that is the purpose of public education. And, a younger me wouldn't have argued at all with you, photography. I think that a long time ago, I looked around and realized that, a society of direction followers is good insofar as the establishment is concerned and for predictability of movement and transactions and stuff like that. But it's not great for the innovation necessary to bring a civil and sophisticated society into the future. And to the extent, go ahead, Norm.
I'm listening to you. I don't think we had intended to talk necessarily about the Twitter and Google decisions from the Supreme Court last week, but this might be an appropriate time to pivot to that. Because as I listen to you, the promise of public education was in part to assure us a literate and well-educated citizenry that could operate under conditions approaching equality in a republic, and thus we wanted every individual to have an education that would make it possible for them to realize their full potential. And that, in terms of the basics, I think makes a lot of sense. Reading, writing, arithmetics, science, technology, education, math, the STEM curriculum. I also think that we had at one point a robust system of teaching social studies, of teaching the ideals that were common to us all. I remember as a child reciting the Pledge of Allegiance in class. I think our commitment to that has declined. Our commitment to teaching a common vision of the good, and now we have warring ideologies about what makes us a society and what creates a sense of entitlement or of right. And so the broader cultural problems that we have now found their way into the classroom. But here's what I was wondering about as you were talking, Mike. We used to talk glibly about the metaphor of a marketplace of ideas, and so we would say that the test of an idea, is its ability to get accepted, and that the marketplace of ideas will help us determine what's true. And that marketplace was never really a free market, so to speak. Back in my childhood, we had three networks. We had dominant media, and all of the news, all of the information that was presented to the public in the marketplace was curated. It was curated by an editorial class that shared common values and a common sense of standards. And they might disagree on nuances, but they didn't disagree on principles. Now, with social media, we've opened up the world to communication in which there is no editorial class making judgments about what is not significant. Here are some interesting statistics that talk about the ubiquity, the all present character of social media in our lives. In the Twitter decision announced by the United States Supreme Court last week, Twitter Inc. versus Taamneh, TAAMNEH. In a decision written by Justice Thomas, he notes that this was a lawsuit brought by the family of an American who was killed in the 2017 terrorist attack on a nightclub in Istanbul, Turkey, the so-called Rina attack. In 2017, listen to these numbers. At the time of the Rina attack, YouTube had over 1 billion active users. Facebook had 2 billion active users, and Twitter had around 300 million active users. Those numbers are even higher today. Meta platform, which operates Facebook, has nearly 3 billion users. YouTube has 2.56 billion users, and Twitter, Twitter's user base continues to extend. At the heart of the Twitter suit was an application of a statute that permits Americans injured by reason of an act of international terrorism to sue for damages. They can sue for damages anybody who aids and abets or assists a terrorist in accomplishing their goal. And so the plaintiffs in the Twitter and in a related case involving Google claim that ISIS's ability to get online in an unmediated and unedited forum gave it the ability to appeal to others to follow them, to appeal to others to join ISIS. And those others who joined, some of them, as in the proponent of the person who did the Rina attack, were ISIS members. And so the plaintiffs wanted to say that because of the algorithms, that is the encoded method by which information is selected, aggregated, and sold, because of the way these algorithms work, ISIS was able to benefit by the use of the Twitter and platform, and by use of the Google platform. They'd put out their messages of hate. The algorithm would associate these and direct it to other people who would be disposed based on the algorithm to respond to that. And a certain percentage of those who responded became activists. And so the claim is that Twitter and Google were complicit. They aided and abetted the terroristic objective because they made it possible for like-minded people to find one another in ways that wouldn't have been possible before. This is the marketplace of ideas. And so we've got this profound public policy problem now where we have made it possible for billions of people to communicate with one another instantaneously for free at scale, so to speak, over the broadest possible networks. And they can find one another, and the algorithms will help direct them to people with similar tastes and aptitudes, and the result is chaos. And so in the Twitter and Google and YouTube suits rather, YouTube's owned by Google. The plaintiffs wanted to say, look, these algorithms, the proprietors of these algorithms, bear responsibility for aiding and abetting terrorist networks because they made it possible for terrorists to find one another. And the court said no. And the legislature Congress may come back and say yes in some form or another. But in Clarence Thomas's opinion in the Twitter case, it was a really good analysis of the aiding and abetting doctrine. And it says, when you aid and abet someone, you have to knowingly engage and decide to engage in an activity that you know to be wrong. And merely hosting the content of others, even if you know that others are going to use it for bad purposes, doesn't have the scienter, the mental state requirement necessary to hold a person criminally liable. And his analysis, I think, is right. But it begs the public policy question that I think is troubling to so many people. And that is, as these ubiquitous, these huge, these ever-present social media engines come to dominate our lives, they make it possible. And here's how, and they operate in the following way. You can sign on for free. You can post what you like. The computer detects what you like. It detects your pattern of engagement. The computer, I make it sound like Hal's out there, but a system determines that, and then it aggregates a profile of you based on your behavior, and using that profile with large data, it contrasts you and compares you to others with your profile and makes predictive decisions, makes predictive recommendations on what you like based on what you have demonstrated to have liked before. That's the marketplace. And so in the context of Twitter and YouTube, we have a market that makes it possible for hatred to be harvested, for hatred to be marketed, and for people with nefarious intent to find one another and do horrible things. The court has said, look, it's not enough to host that and say that because bad things can happen, therefore the company's responsible. That would be the moral equivalent of saying because people can use the telephone for goodwill or bad, when they use it for bad, we should penalize the phone company. And so I support his reasoning. As a free speech absolutist, I appreciated the analysis, but I also know that it leaves unresolved this problem of algorithmic association. There's a wonderful phrase he used in there. I made a note of it this morning. Oh gosh, I should have. Yeah. The algorithm is agnostic as to the means that it uses. So we've got agnostic algorithms making a true marketplace of ideas possible, creating a sense of social chaos and disintegration. And we don't have the sort of editorial control or standards we had when there were fewer means of communicating with one another. But the rhetoric of the marketplace of ideas was taken seriously there. But it was a false rhetoric because it was a regulated market. It was regulated by people with discernible standards of content, taste, and what was appropriate. We've eliminated standards of taste, content, and what's appropriate. And now we have a true marketplace of ideas, and we're having trouble living with the consequences. And the result, I think, is what we see in Ray Cooper and others. We have a public controversy, a public crisis, because we have no way of determining what is in the common good anymore, other than an appeal to raw numbers. And those raw numbers really don't yield anything but warring silos. And so there is a crying need for something more than an algorithm, in my view.
Well, yeah, and the back and forth, at least in the public school context, is something like those who are there to forward the interest of the institutions as established. And then there are those who are trying to extricate themselves and their children from a system that is at best opaque as to the inputs, right? And at worst, indoctrinating against the values of the home from whence those children came, right?
No, and I think that's right.
And that's what I mean when I say things like maybe social media should be regulated by the FDA, right? The same way that CBD is only approved as, some sort of purified cannabidiol solution in childhood epilepsy drugs, right? And so thus you can't put it in food, you can't put it in drinks, all these other things. There is a diet of information that people are consuming via algorithms within social media. And I
But
think
isn't that the very form of authoritarianism we rail against? Because
I'm not saying,
having
look, I'm
content
just making
moderated
a joke. I'm making a joke about the way that Section 230 regulates social media, or at least exempts them from liability, because I think that there's upside to that, sure. But I'm poking at how ridiculous our means of trying to solve these problems ultimately are right now. I simply don't think that we as a society have developed the tools to adequately get at solving this question, right?
Okay, I
And
didn't get the joke, but
so
the
the
joke
joke
on
the
me.
joke is that we should treat social media more like food and drugs than we should like a mechanism of internet whatever or speech. It's there needs to be a recognition that this pattern of injecting people with algorithmically driven information streams has some sort of non-zero effect on the way that they process information, the way they communicate with their friends and loved ones, the way that they see things from a partisan lens and choose to go to the voting booth. All of these things are very obvious now, but we haven't ever dealt with this as a society. Not even the printing press presented problems of this scale, right?
Well,
Because
I mean, I think the printing
it's
press
somewhat
did.
practical,
The
right?
Protestant Revolution, Protestant Reformation, rather, when everybody was able to read the Bible for themselves in their own vernacular and seek the voice of God within the pages as they heard it themselves. We ended up with the English Civil Wars, among other things, where there was no consensus even around common norms, even around stated common norms. A biblical culture. We don't even have stated common norms any longer, Mike. And so, the joke is on me again on this FDA regulation thing. I don't think we can have a marketplace that is regulated by the government, but I think an unregulated marketplace of ideas is an unmitigated disaster.
Well, let me
And
take it a bit further. When I say FDA regulation, I'm thinking mostly like nutritional labeling panels, right? It's mostly a disclosure issue, right? If you're a company putting products into commerce that are meant to be food, right? There isn't sort of a front end approval mechanism for getting your labels approved by FDA standards. Now, if you're in beer and wine and spirituous liquor, it's different with the TTB. But what I'm saying is that you are required to disclose nutritional values of the ingredients in your product to a very specific degree.
what would be the analog for nutritional values in terms of the marketplace of ideas?
I just think that, look, there's something to the fact that people are addicted to the infinite scroll and the dopamine hit of getting enough likes and shares of their content, right, on Instagram in particular, and that's a Facebook-owned entity. So I think that in terms of our biology, there is something that has been unlocked by social media companies with respect to keeping eyeballs and attention on those screens. And I guess that the line that I'm drawing here is that we have become so subsumed by that phenomenon, like we're in the middle of it, that we can't see how obvious something like Governor Roy Cooper saying there's a state of emergency over public school funding when the legislature is functioning perfectly well and as intended. And the constituents of these legislators are happy because this is an outcome that they've wanted since COVID ushered in an era of top-down, more authoritarian style enforcement of norms and laws, right? Making people criminals if they wanted to be together in a social situation, even in their private homes, right? People rejected that, and he can't live with the fruits of that rejection. And so he's using the same technology and the same methodology that he did when he had adequate political cover to do so in this situation.
I think Justin's right. We need more time on this one. I think we've hit a raw nerve here, and law and legitimacy, folks, is a rolling discussion. If we had answers, I don't know. I guess we'd tell them, and we'd be selling them, and we'd be independently wealthy, and all that other jazz. What we are two guys pilgrims, struggling as you are, trying to understand the contours of our
Trying to grow corn.
Yeah, trying to grow corn, trying to make sense of the world around us. And I think we've hit on a raw nerve based on the comments and certainly based on our discussions. Let's return to this again. We never got to some of the stuff we intended to talk to today. I want to give I've been reading through the Durham report very carefully, in particular, its treatment of confidential human sources and also its use of law enforcement discretion to engage in domestic intelligence gathering on American citizens. That's something that we should all be concerned about. And we will return to it. And we will also talk more about social media algorithms and how to control the marketplace of ideas if it can be controlled. And we'll ask fundamental questions. If it can't be, do we really want to live with the consequences? And does a society depend at some level on a common vision of the good? And if it does, doesn't that mean that some people are better able to discern it than others? And how do you have that without authoritarianism? These are important questions, and we'll return to them in the days and weeks to come.
We will. And Daily Wire broke a story about the University of Minnesota being, they had a civil rights complaint filed against them by the Equal Protection, what is that? The Equal Protection Coalition. Forget the name of the actual Equal Protection Project. I apologize. So that's dealing with, yet more evolution of what we have seen from college campuses and creating safe spaces, et cetera. So we'll get to that. And then, of course, as always, I have to say, Rumblers, turn the thumbs up green. YouTubers, turn it blue. And if you're on Twitter, gift us a retweet. Share the stream. If you're an audio-only listener, you know where to find us. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Google Play, etc. We're here every day, 8 a.m. Eastern. Do consider becoming a member on Locals and gifting us a subscription there. But as Norm said, I think that these are rolling conversations. We will do better about having longer form discussions. I think that perhaps we should do just a Q&A sometime this week. I know you and I talked about it, Norm, and see if we can't rove our way back into this conversation. I personally am fascinated by the confluence of education and law right now, alongside our developing appetite for understanding social media and technology, and the way that those are being used hand in hand with federal and state governments.
Yeah, and I think we all have an interest in this conversation because, like it or not, we have to live together, and the forces and factors that are driving us apart need to be mastered if we want to have a common life together. And I think we all do, or we wouldn't be here. So come back tomorrow. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening.
Sounds good. See you tomorrow, Norm.